Welcome to another edition of Fiscal Lab Update. My name is William Beach. I'm the Executive Director of the Fiscal Lab on Capitol Hill. Today we're talking about the 3% deficit target that has been endorsed and advanced by the House Budget Committee and by some members of the House leadership. In fact, we're here to talk about a paper that Parker Sheppard, Senior Fellow in Economics with the Fiscal Lab, has written on this 3% deficit target. So, Parker, welcome to the update.
Hey, good to be here to talk.
So this is an aspiration of the Congress to move our spending to something called a 3% deficit target or level. What's the problem they're trying to solve?
The problem they're trying to solve is that the debt that the federal government holds is projected to grow without bound. It will grow to the point where CBO has stopped projecting
Congressional budget. Right.
It's so far in the future. If Congress does nothing, if it remains on the path that it's on, then we will see debt grow from about 100% of GDP up to 160% of GDP. And so something needs to happen to get things turned around. Anything that cannot go on forever must eventually stop. And so this idea of getting a 3% deficit target is a way of reining in the current deficits from around 6% GDP to something that could be more manageable.
So when you say percent of GDP, you're talking about the size of the U.S. economy. Is that inflation adjusted or not inflation adjusted size?
So it's both. Having debt grow is not necessarily a problem. The point is that the debt needs to grow at the same pace as our ability to make payments on it.
Okay.
So we don't necessarily need to pay off the debt all the way to zero, which it did briefly during Andrew Jackson's presidency. The federal government was briefly at zero debt, but that shouldn't necessarily be the goal. Even having a balanced budget, so debt just represents the stock of past deficits. Getting back to a balanced budget where the federal government's revenues equal the federal government's outlays isn't even necessary because the economy is growing over time. So if the federal government leaves taxes in place generally, then as the economy grows, revenues should grow, and the current level of debt would go from being high to manageable if Congress just simply could keep spending within line so that it didn't outpace economic growth.
So having a balanced budget is not a bad thing. It's really difficult to attain. Is that what you're saying?
Congress needs to evaluate the trade-offs.
Yeah.
When they think about raising revenue, if they are directly applying distortionary taxes, then that gives people an incentive to try to figure out how to limit their exposure. It harms their return to investing in new businesses. So it discourages economic growth, which is precisely what they need in order to get more revenue. It can be better for Congress to take a smaller slice of a bigger pie. And as long as the pie continues to grow, then the payments that it needs to make on the outstanding debt become more manageable.
So there's a couple of concepts you might want to clarify. Primary deficit and total deficit. Can you quickly distinguish the two from each other?
So a lot of people will look at the level of debt outstanding, and they could say, let me take everything the federal government owes and put it on a per person basis and think, wow, if I had to pay off, the number keeps going up over time, but it's like $60,000 to $70,000 per person. That would be a lot for you to pay off as a single household, but the government doesn't operate quite like a household. It can continually roll over payments over time because we'll see we pass on the government and our country to the next generation. So what matters is the payment that we continue to make each year. The primary deficit is simply each year's revenues and outlays. And it's total spending ignoring the interest costs. Interest costs then are simply the cost of rolling over the debt. And that happens when when Congress has borrowed for something. So debt reached its all-time high during World War II. We spent a lot to fight World War II and then paid it down over many years after the fact. Congress brought forward some expenses and then repaid them over time. So the interest expense is just it's the cost for bringing forward its expenditure in time.
So you have like several things going here. You've got the economy growing, you've got debt growing, and presumably if the economy grows at a certain pace and interest rates grow at a certain pace, is that a problem? Is that a good thing? What's the relationship between the growth of interest rates and the growth of the economy? Why do you emphasize that in your paper? This is such an interesting concept.
Interest rates, like any market price, tend to fluctuate over time. So interest rates are the cost of bringing forward spending. You say, I could wait to spend, but I would like to pay. I'd be willing to pay extra in order to spend sooner. And if everyone is trying to bring payments forward, that drives up interest rates. Okay. Typically, often people like to save. There's a mix of people throughout the economy. Some people want to spend now, some people want to spend later. And treasuries can be a useful vehicle for saving. A lot of people like to buy treasuries and wait. So they're willing to lend to the government because they don't want to spend now, they want to spend later. We've seen that with the rise of globalization. There have been a lot of other developing countries that have had taken their savings and brought it over to the United States, and that has tended to push interest rates down, which makes borrowing cheap for the federal government.
Okay, so let's define a term just in case somebody doesn't know. When you say treasuries, are you referring to the 10-year note or 2-year notes or just any note?
It could be any federal government debt of any maturity. The point is that it's an obligation of the federal government, and the federal government has been a safe bet to repay its debts historically.
So what happens when the economy slows down but interest rates don't slow down? Is that I understand your paper. You make the argument that that's not a very good thing.
So it is what matters is the relative standing of economic growth and interest rates.
Okay.
So if interest rates are low and economic growth is high, that's a great place to be in. You can borrow at 3% to make 4% all day long and never run into any problems repaying your debt, because by delaying the payment into the future, you're going to have, the money's going to be there when you need to make the payment. What runs into a problem is when interest rates get really high and economic growth slows down. That's when it really does cost money for the federal government to have a very large stock of outstanding debt. And
we've had that situation several times recently.
Immediately following the pandemic, the Federal Reserve brought rates down to zero. And the fact that COVID made it difficult to go out and work and live normally depressed a lot of economic activity. So there was a slowdown for a while. But then there was also rapid growth coming back.
Right.
So there wasn't the same drag on the debt at that time because we were seeing a pretty rapid bounce back, and rates stayed low in part because of monetary policy, trying to keep short-term rates low, while there was this big federal stimulus program. There are a lot of payments coming from Congress to help tie people over when they didn't have regular work available. And the outcome of that was a very natural consequence that inflation ran really high. we were borrowing from the future to come to the present, and you had too many dollars that were chasing not enough goods, and that tended to drive the price up across the board. And so to correct that inflation, you've seen rates go up, and we're now seeing a transition from the situation where low rates have been a factor that have been helping to stabilize the debt to now that they're starting to push up higher than growth and be something that's really going to drag on the federal debt on top of existing already high primary deficits.
Okay, so let's get back then to the 3% target, because there's a relationship between this rolling over the debt and the growth of the economy. So why is 3% a good number? Why is that the chosen target?
Is that the over the long run, you see that people have this inherent willingness to wait. That that doesn't really change. Maybe it fluctuates a little bit up and down with conditions in the business cycle, whether there's an expansion or a recession. But generally, this seems to be something that's stable across people. They're willing to wait a little bit, about 2% on real terms. The federal government, or sorry, the Federal Reserve has targeted about 2% for inflation. So you tend to see economic growth be around 4%. So a 3% deficit is enough to have to roughly track long run economic growth over time. It's effectively about where the primary deficit is roughly in balance, and the federal government is able to make interest payments on the outstanding debt because of a growing economy. And this is largely, if you look at the historical record, this seems to be about where Congress wants to set its budgets. It can take a deficit. Effectively, a deficit is a target that can be split between making payments on interest and a primary deficit. And sometimes Congress chooses a little more one or a little more the other, but it largely seems to be in some combination of around a 3% target. It fits what we've seen over the historical record.
You have a graphic in your paper that connects the dots, so to speak, between net interest payments and the primary deficit. We're going to put that on the screen so everybody can see it. Tell us what we ought to be looking for in that graphic.
Sure. So here I'm making the point that Congress has to continue to make interest payments on the level of on the debt that's already outstanding, and that given the interest that it's already obligated to pay, it can choose a primary deficit, and the combination of the two add up to the total deficit. So if there's a 3% deficit target, then the green line that goes from the top left down to the bottom right are all the combinations of the primary deficit and net interest expense that hit the 3% deficit target. And you can see that it goes right through about where the bulk of the historical points are in the data. Some years are above, some years are below. I think it's about roughly half the time. They're pretty close to that 3% target. If you take the median net interest expense, it's around 1.5% of GDP. The median primary deficit is about 1%, but then of course you have these large years in the financial crisis and the pandemic where we had these very large primary deficits. So you can see those in the middle up top where those are years where the deficit's really high. But by and large, Congress has been flipping around this 3% target where you can see it's about right at about where the primary deficit is in balance or just a small deficit, and there's a modest net interest expense. That seems to be where Congress wants to set the deficit most of the time. It's in line with the 3% target.
Okay, so our total deficit right now is running a little under 6%, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's really unsustainable. So getting back to a 3%, will that require spending cuts or revenue increases, or I don't know what is, we get to annex Greenland. What's the solution? How do we
Well,
get there?
it could be a mixture of both. So mechanically, the primary deficit occurs anytime that spending outpaces revenues. So Congress can fix the primary deficit by either cutting spending or by raising revenues. But if Congress raises revenues by increasing taxes, one, it's revenues have averaged about 17% of GDP since World War II. They have not gone above 19 or 20%. A recent paper from the Joint Committee on Taxation found that the tax system is operating pretty close to the top of the Laffer curve. So the Laffer curve recognizes that if tax rates are zero, the government doesn't collect any revenue. If tax rates go all the way to 100, then nobody is going to declare their income to pay any revenue to the government either. So there's some point in the middle that represents some revenue maximizing rate, and our system is largely there. So it's not likely the case that the federal government can tap this untapped revenue to find its way out of the primary deficit. They're going to have to look pretty hard at the spending that's out there and find ways to bring that in line with what they're able to collect in revenue.
So if we operate at this 3%, let's suppose in some really great future, near term, we get down from a little less than 6, move away from that movement up to 6, and back down to 3%. That makes it easier, doesn't it, for us to respond to emergencies and to do things like foreign wars or whatever? I mean, is that because those would cause the deficit to go up, right? Well, I would
Right.
assume.
So the concept you're thinking about there is referred to as fiscal space. A government has fiscal space if it has the ability to take on new debt without substantially affecting interest rates. No one really knows exactly where how much fiscal space the federal government has available. You see a lot of talk in Washington about the debt limit, but that's the debt limit that's under discussion is what Congress sets for itself. It says we authorize the Treasury to issue debt up until such and such a dollar amount, and then they need to go back to authorize themselves to issue more. The real debt limit that matters, though, is what the Congress is what the markets are willing to lend to the federal government. And so, if the markets decide that they don't want to take on the risk of buying federal debt, if they think that the federal government isn't going to repay the debt or is going to just print money and inflate away the real value of the debt, then they're not going to be interested in buying any more of it. You'll see interest rates go up.
That's why you argue in the paper, in the closing part of the paper, that if you have a deficit target, you need a debt target as well.
That's right, because that interest expense is proportional to the amount of debt that's outstanding. So the higher the debt, then the bigger the headwind or tailwind you get from having these interest rate swings. So over the past decade and a half, the federal government's debt has been inching up, meaning that its fiscal position is more susceptible to these swings in interest rate conditions. And if the federal government has this large debt that's outstanding, and people begin to doubt that it has the will to repay it, and they want to ask for an interest rate premium, well, then that just starts off a vicious cycle. Rates go up, it becomes harder for them to make payments on the debt goes up even more. And so when the debt goes up more, people ask for a bigger risk premium, and so on and so on. So before that gets started off, that's the time when Congress needs to move back towards a modest deficit in order to get the debt at a stable position.
So Parker, let me ask you one question about this target now that we're involved with the Iran conflict. So Had we had as I understand it, a 3% target all along, and now we have to spend 300, $400 billion more, that would be doable, right? I mean, how does that contrast with the situation that we're now in, where we have such a greater deficit? In other words, what's the connection between your 3% target and international events?
So that I wouldn't necessarily think about the 3% target, but I would think about the debt and fiscal space.
Okay.
And the situation is more about how much fiscal space is available to the federal government so that it can tap that fiscal space when something like the Iran war comes out. When it has this unexpected expense, it's going to need to go back to markets and ask to borrow more money. And the question is, are markets willing to lend it to the federal government? And if they are, at what price? Because as the federal government gets closer to the fiscal limit, to running out of fiscal space, that's when markets will get more aggressive about asking for a risk premium. And that's where you start to reach the point of no return, where higher interest rates add on to more debt, which adds back onto more interest rates.
Yeah. And then maintaining a 3% deficit target, now shifting away from foreign affairs, would make it less likely, as I understand, that we would have deficit-driven inflation. If some argue that there is a connection between rising deficits and ultimately rising price levels. Is that your view of the matter?
I'd say it's both fiscal policy and monetary policy that are together determining how interest rates move and how that gets affected into inflation. It's both Congress and the Federal Reserve that need to work together in concert to ensure that the Federal Reserve is able to have the room to be able to raise interest rates to maintain its inflation target, and that Congress is doing its role in balancing the budget by reducing outlays when necessary when interest rates are climbing, in order to ensure that the government's budget is balanced across time.
Right.
Because the flip side of doing that is saying that Congress is just going to run deficits forever, and that would eventually force a position where the Federal Reserve, the bigger the deficit that Congress runs, the more it puts the Fed in a hard place to make a choice between raising interest rates to tamp down on inflation at the risk of slowing down the economy, or giving in, keeping interest rates low, and letting inflation run away and chip away at the debt.
So you've thought of another way of sort of graphically showing how deficits and interest rates are connected to one another. Why don't you explain that interesting relationship?
Yeah, you can think about, so again, the paper is about the combination of the primary deficit and interest expense adding to the debt to GDP ratio. And that there are times when they're acting as gas, making the debt to GDP ratio go up, and there's times when they're acting as brakes, making the debt to GDP go down. And if you plot them over time, you can see that they're often in balance. But there are times when, if you look at the past couple of years, since 2008 and the financial crisis, we've run large primary deficits that have tended to raise the debt to GDP ratio, while at the same time, we've had low interest rates, and that has tended to keep the growth adjusted interest expense, keeping the debt in check. So it's not that that interest rates, not that there's no interest expense. It's just that the interest that the federal government has been paying has been low enough to be affordable in the context of a growing economy. But if you go and you look at the past few years since the pandemic, you can see that there are these large subtractions coming from interest expense. But over the past couple of years, as the Federal Reserve has tried to raise rates to keep inflation in check, that has turned from something that has been tamping down on the debt to GDP ratio, that could be something that starts to accelerate a vicious cycle in ever-growing debt to GDP.
Yeah, by the way, I just love that chart. I think that's really I think it demonstrates the point between monetary policy, interest rates, and so forth and so on, and debt or the deficits. But it also shows how gravely different the recent past has been. It's just amazing. Right. So this deficit target is really a wonderful way to sort of start a plan, right? You need to have a spending plan or a revenue plan or some fiscal plan to get down to that deficit. And then what? You need a debt target. That's a good thing. And then the fiscal. So is that the way you would kind of sum up the advantages or the benefits that come from having a target that's 3% of GDP?
I think when you make a plan, you want it to be reasonable. You want it to be something that you stick to. And I think having a budget is a lot like starting a diet. A lot of people go and they start a diet and they get really excited and they say, I'm going to do nothing but eat fruits and vegetables. I'm going to go really hard. I'm going to skip lunch, skip dinner, and I'm going to slim down as fast as I can. And then something unexpected happens. They're out. They go to a friend's party. The friend has some cake, and it looks really good. And they say, okay. They can't stick to their plan, and they give in and have some cake. And then the next day, they're like, well, I had some cake. I was off the diet. Am I really going to stick to this? Is this a thing I'm going to do? And then they just give up on it altogether. The problem is that they set a goal that was very difficult to maintain, and when they didn't maintain it, they didn't have a plan for how to get back on track. Right. So that for Congress, it's the same way. They need to have a reasonable goal, figuring out, saying, planning to balance the budget entirely requires a lot of cuts. 3% is manageable. It doesn't. It's half the deficit of 6% that's currently out there, as opposed to all of it, and it's sufficient to keep the debt from exploding. And you should recognize that you need to have some room available for fiscal space. You need to have. There will be unexpected emergencies, so you shouldn't carry a debt level that goes all the way to maxing out your fiscal space. You should come away from the edge so you recognize that there will be unexpected events that happen, and that you need to plan for the unexpected and know that will be there. You deviate from the original plan a little. Basically, you plan for the unplannable things and know that it's not breaking the plan. It's just a temporary pause before you return back to target.
Well, we've all been there with diets, and it's good to have a plan. It's good to keep trying, right? I think this is one of the great issues of our age, is this seemingly uncontrollable growth in total debt and the annual deficits, and so that's really great. By the way, carrot cake is my big problem when I think about eating right. Well, Parker, thank you very much for this extraordinary paper and for the insights that you've given us on the update. If you have any final words before we close this segment of the update?
I think it's up to Congress to decide. 3% is not a magic number. You should recognize that it's not like you don't have to be exactly 3. 2.99 is right out. There's some wiggle room, but you should just be clear-eyed and realize that while there may be some uncertainty, you don't sweat the details. Don't get too wrapped up in being too precise. Do be aware that 6% deficits are something that will cause debt to climb, and that eventually that interest rate will kick in, people will ask for the risk premium, and the vicious cycle will go off, and that's something that Congress wants to avoid. The details aren't as important as finding balance.
Yeah, we have to avoid the vicious cycle at all costs. Well, thank you again. And if you want to read more about Parker's analysis, his paper is posted and available at no charge at www.fiscallab.org. And thank you all for joining this version of the update. And Parker, thank you very much for your comments on the 3% deficit target.
Yeah, thanks, Bill.